weary listener to an even deeper, more profound immersion into the quiet, yet intensely lived world of the 17th century Puritan settler. Tonight, we will dedicate ourselves, with the utmost patience and detail, to a singular, extended journey through the hidden truths of a Puritan village. Drift as we paint an intricate, sensory portrait of a world where every action, every thought, was woven into a tapestry of devout faith, demanding labor, and unyielding communal bonds. Allow the gentle rhythm of our words to transport you as we uncover the deep truths of a life of unparalleled spiritual striving, relentless self-discipline, and an enduring quest for a profound and singular purpose. Let the quiet hum of distant history guide your thoughts, designed for your most profound rest. For the next many, many moments, we will meticulously unfold the layers of their daily existence, exploring the very fabric of their lives, from the stark chill of their early mornings to the deep, silent watch of their sacred Sabbaths. Lay back, allow your body to soften, and let your mind release its grip on the present. Imagine, if you will, the profound darkness of the pre-dawn hours within a small, humble Puritan home. There is no artificial glow of electric light here, only the deep, encompassing blackness, broken, perhaps, by the faint glimmer of dying embers in the stone hearth, or the pale, ethereal light of the moon, filtering through a single, small window pane, often made not of clear glass, but of oiled paper or small, irregular leaded panes. The air is still, and in the colder months it carries a palpable chill that settles deep into the bones, a stark reminder of the wild, untamed land just beyond the rough-hewn walls. The first stirrings of the household would begin long before the sun's ascent, typically around 4 or 5 in the morning. This early awakening was not a choice, but a necessity, ingrained by both the demands of survival and the strictures of their faith. To waste the precious hours of daylight in slumber was considered a sin against God's commandment to labor diligently. Imagine the sound of a rustle of coarse linen, the soft shuffle of bare feet on a cold wooden floor. The warmth from the previous day's fire would have largely dissipated, leaving the single main room, serving as kitchen, living area, and often sleeping space for the entire family, in a state of quiet, biting cold. The very first deliberate action of the day would be to tend to the hearth. Perhaps a single ember still glowed, carefully banked in the ashes from the night before. With a gentle breath, a few dried leaves or bits of birch bark, and then thin strips of kindling, the fire would slowly be coaxed back to life. Imagine the delicate, almost tender care given to this process. The crackle and pop as the flames hesitantly caught, casting dancing shadows on the rough plaster walls, slowly pushing back the encroaching cold. This ritual of fire starting was not just about warmth. It was a daily act of creation, a primal connection to survival. Once the nascent warmth began to spread, the family would gather. This was not a time for casual conversation or leisurely waking. This was the moment for morning prayers, led by the head of the household, the father. Imagine the family kneeling or standing with heads bowed in the dim, flickering light of the growing fire. The prayers would be lengthy, heartfelt, and extemporaneous, often drawing heavily from biblical verses. There would be scripture readings, perhaps a psalm sung in unison, a low, solemn melody echoing in the quiet room. This profound act of devotion was the absolute first commitment of the day, consecrating their waking hours, acknowledging God's providence, and seeking His guidance for the toil ahead. It was a time for self-reflection, for repentance, for setting one's heart and mind upon the arduous path of righteousness. Following this sacred beginning, a simple and entirely functional meal would be prepared. Imagine the subtle, earthy aroma of cornmeal porridge, perhaps cooked directly over the open flame in a heavy iron pot, or perhaps cold, leftover bread, baked the day before, would be broken and shared. The drink would be water, drawn from a nearby well, cool and pure, or perhaps cider from the previous autumn's apple press. There was no idleness at this table. Meals were not a social event for light chatter, but a time for sustenance, taken quickly, with grace offered before and after, a silent acknowledgement of God's provision. Every bite was fuel for the demanding hours that stretched ahead. The very atmosphere of these early moments was one of solemn purpose. Each family member understood their role, their duties, and the relentless cycle of work that awaited them. There was a quiet determination in their movements, a deep-seated acceptance of the hardships, and a profound conviction that their labor, however mundane, was a direct service to God. The cold, the simplicity, the early hour, all contributed to a pervasive sense of gravity, a quiet preparation for another day of endurance and devotion in the wilderness that was their new home. As the first true light of dawn began to paint the sky, a pale gray giving way to hues of pink and gold, the village would slowly come to life, not with chatter and commotion, but with the quiet, determined sounds of toil. Life in a Puritan village was not merely about survival. It was about building a city upon a hill, a sacred community forged through unceasing effort. And this effort was rigorously divided by gender, each role vital, each task demanding. For the men of the Puritan village, their labor was an unending dialogue with the raw, often unforgiving wilderness. Their primary task was to carve existence from the dense forests and stubborn earth. Imagine the sheer brute strength required to clear land. Picture the rhythmic swing of a broad axe, the resounding thud as it bit into massive oak or pine, the gradual groaning fall of a towering tree. Then came the arduous work of digging out immense stumps, hauling away countless rocks unearthed from the stony New England soil, all to prepare a patch of earth for cultivation. This back-breaking work was often performed not in isolation, but in communal work bees, where neighbors would gather to help one another, strengthening the very fabric of their community through shared effort and mutual aid. The air would be filled with the sounds of grunts, the scrape of tools, and the shared rhythm of heavy labor. Once cleared, the fields became their primary domain. Spring brought the deep, slow process of plowing, often with a team of oxen, the earth turning in heavy furrows. Then, the meticulous work of planting, scattering seeds of corn, beans, squash, and sometimes wheat, each seed a tiny prayer for sustenance. Imagine the feeling of the rough earth in their hands, the smell of freshly turned soil. Summer was a season of constant vigilance, endless weeding, protecting precious crops from pests, tending to livestock, cows, pigs, sheep, ensuring their health and productivity. The peak of the agricultural year was harvest time, a furious, intense period of labor, often stretching from early morning until late into the night, racing against the unpredictable New England weather to bring in the vital bounty before the first frost. Picture the rhythmic swing of a scythe, cutting tall stalks, the bending, the bundling, the lifting of heavy sheaves, the sweat stinging their eyes under a relentless sun. Beyond farming, men were the builders and protectors. They would fell trees, not just for clearing land, but for timber, shaping rough logs into beams and planks for constructing houses, barns, meeting houses, and fences. Imagine the resonant sound of hammer on wood, the planning and precision, the calloused hands that shaped their very world. They would hunt for game in the surrounding forests, providing crucial protein, and fish in the abundant rivers and coastal waters, a constant source of food. Essential crafts like blacksmithing, carpentry, and coopering were also the domain of men, requiring specific skills honed through years of practice. Every task, whether communal or individual, was essential for the survival and growth of the settlement. Idleness was not simply discouraged. It was considered a grave sin against God's commandment to labor diligently, a sign of a slothful spirit, unworthy of God's grace. For the women of the Puritan village, their domain was the hearth and home. Yet their labor was no less continuous, physically demanding, or vital to the family's survival. Imagine the sheer, staggering array of tasks that filled a Puritan woman's day. From the earliest light to the deep shadows of evening, food preparation was a constant, multifaceted process. It began with the raw ingredients, grinding dried corn into meal, a repetitive, grinding motion. Then, the making of bread, a daily ritual that often involved baking in large, outdoor brick ovens. Imagine the careful tending of the fire within the oven, the kneading of heavy dough with strong forearms, the pervasive, comforting aroma of fresh-baked bread that permeated the home. Churning butter from fresh milk was another rhythmic, time-consuming task. The consistent, up-and-down motion of the churner slowly transforming liquid into solid sustenance. But perhaps the most critical work was food preservation for the long, lean winter months. This involved salting meat and fish, hanging fruits and vegetables to dry in the sun or by the fire, and making cider or preserves. Imagine the subtle, earthy smells of drying herbs, the salty temps of cured meat, the sweet scent of simmering fruit. Textile production was a monumental undertaking, demanding endless hours of meticulous labor. From raw wool, often shorn from the family's own sheep, women would meticulously clean and prepare the fibers. Then they would card the wool using hand cards to comb and straighten the fibers. This was followed by the constant, rhythmic whir of the spinning wheel, transforming the carded wool or flax into thread. Imagine the nimble fingers drafting the fibers, the consistent rotation of the wheel, the gentle hum that would have been an almost constant background sound in every Puritan home. This thread would then be transported to the handloom, where it would be meticulously woven into cloth, a slow, deliberate process of passing the shuttle back and forth, building fabric inch by painstaking inch. From this rough, homespun fabric, all the clothing for the entire family would be cut and sewn by hand, a task involving countless hours of fine needlework, patching, and mending to ensure every garment lasted as long as possible. Every stitch, every thread, every garment represented immense effort and skill. Beyond these major domestic industries, there was the endless routine of maintaining the household. This included making soap from lye and animal fat, a pungent and arduous process that provided essential cleaning agents. Crafting candles from rendered tallow or beeswax was another vital task, providing the only source of evening light beyond the hearth fire. Imagine the methodical dipping of wicks, building up layers of wax. Women also gathered wild herbs for medicinal purposes, tended small kitchen gardens for fresh produce, and, of course, carried the tireless, constant work of child-rearing. Puritan families were large, and infant mortality rates were tragically high. Yet women were responsible for numerous children from birth through their early education in piety and household duties. The fire in the hearth, the literal and symbolic heart of the home, demanded constant attention, feeding it, banking it carefully at night to preserve embers, and patiently rekindling it in the morning. Every single aspect of a woman's daily life was physically demanding, leaving little time for rest, contemplation, or personal pursuits. The concept of leisure, as we understand it, simply did not exist. Let us now step into the very architecture of their lives, observing their homes and the clothes upon their backs. The Puritan dwelling was a direct reflection of their values, functional, unadorned, and designed for practicality rather than luxury. Imagine the typical Puritan house. It was a sturdy, often single-room structure, though larger families might have a small sleeping loft or an attached lean-to. The construction was simple, yet robust. Heavy timber frames, often unpainted, filled in with wattle and daub, or rough-sawn planks. The roofs were pitched, designed to shed snow and rain, and often covered with wooden shingles, or, in the earliest days, thatch. Imagine the feel of the rough-hewn timbers, perhaps still smelling faintly of fresh-cut pine or oak. The raw, unfinished surfaces, a constant tactile reminder of their wilderness origins. Inside, the central feature was always the stone hearth and chimney, a massive structure that served as the sole source of heat for cooking and warmth. It was truly the heart of the home, where most of the household activity converged. Furnishings were sparse and practical. A heavy wooden table, perhaps a few simple stools or benches, and crude wooden chests for storage. Beds were often shared, with mattresses filled with straw or corn husks, providing a thin barrier from the cold floor. Imagine the constant battle against drafts, the way the fire's warmth seemed to gather only around the hearth, leaving the corners of the room in perpetual chill. The lack of privacy within these homes was profound, with multiple family members, and often apprentices or servants, sharing a single main room. There was little to no personal space. Conversations were rarely private, and the sounds and activities of one part of the room were audible to all. Lighting, as we noted, was limited to the hearth fire during the day, and flickering candles or crude oil lamps at night, casting long, dancing shadows that deepened the sense of enclosed space. Sanitation was basic. An outdoor privy was the norm, and water had to be fetched from a communal well, often shared by several families. Now, consider their dress. Puritan clothing was designed for practicality, durability, and a staunch rejection of vanity. Imagine the rough texture of homespun woolen or linen cloth, often in shades of gray, brown, blue, or undyed cream, while popular imagination sometimes depicts them exclusively in black. This was often reserved for ministers and formal occasions, and black dyes were expensive. Clothing was hand-sewn, meant to last for years, constantly mended and patched until threadbare. Styles were simple. Long skirts and bodices for women, often with white linen caps and aprons. Breeches, simple shirts, and waistcoats for men. Imagine the feel of the coarse fabric against the skin, the simple cut that allowed for ease of movement during arduous labor. Sumptuary laws often regulated dress, dictating what various social classes could and could not wear, reinforcing the idea of a structured hierarchical society where outward appearance reflected one's station and inward piety. Fancy lace, colorful ribbons, or ostentatious jewelry were frowned upon, seen as symbols of worldly pride and vanity, distractions from the spiritual path. Their clothing was a visual sermon, reflecting their belief in humility, industry, and a sober dedication to God. Finally, their diet was a testament to both ingenuity and scarcity. Imagine a monotonous, yet often hearty, array of staple foods. Corn was central, ground into meal for porridge, bread, or sap. Beans and squash, learned from Native Americans, were also crucial. Proteins came primarily from fish and salted or smoked meat, which allowed preservation for months. Imagine the distinct, salty taste of cured meat, a staple throughout the lean winter. Vegetables were often limited to what could be grown in their small gardens and preserved, with very little fresh produce available outside of the harvest season. Fruit, if available, was also preserved through drying or making cider. Meals were simple, often eaten from wooden trenchers or pewter plates, without much fuss or variety. The diet was functional, designed to sustain strenuous labor, but lacked the diversity and richness we associate with modern meals. Every morsel was valued, a direct blessing from the fields, the forests, and the sea, all sustained by God's guiding hand. Beyond the tangible realities of physical labor and material simplicity, the deepest hidden truth of a Puritan village resided in the inner landscape of its inhabitants. A profound, constant, almost suffocating awareness of sin, salvation, and the pervasive presence of a judging yet loving God. This spiritual reality permeated every aspect of their being, shaping their psychological world and their interactions with one another. At the core of their belief system lay Calvinist doctrines, particularly the concept of predestination. Imagine the immense weight of this idea. God, in his infinite wisdom, had already chosen who would be saved and who would be damned, even before the creation of the world. Human beings, inherently corrupted by original sin, could do nothing to earn their salvation. It was a gift of God's unmerited grace. However, one was expected to live a life that demonstrated one's election, a life of profound piety, relentless industry, moral rectitude, and obedience to God's laws. This created a peculiar and intense internal dynamic, not a striving for salvation, but a striving to prove that one was already among the saved. This led to a culture of constant introspection and self-examination. Imagine a Puritan individual at the end of a long, arduous day, sitting quietly by the dying embers of the fire, meticulously reviewing every thought, every word, every action of the past hours. Was there a moment of pride? To waste the precious hours of daylight in slumber was a fleeting thought of envy, a lapse in diligence. These were not trivial matters. They were seen as potential signs of unregenerate spirit, subtle whispers of the devil's influence. Many Puritans kept detailed spiritual journals, meticulously recording their inner struggles, their moments of doubt, their perceived failings, and any fleeting glimpse of God's grace. This intense psychological burden, this perpetual self-scrutiny, could be deeply anxiety-provoking, a relentless inner dialogue seeking assurance of one's spiritual state. The belief in divine providence further intensified this spiritual lens. Imagine every event, no matter how small or grand, being interpreted as a direct manifestation of God's will or judgment. A bountiful harvest was not merely the result of hard work and good weather. It was a clear sign of God's favor upon the righteous community. Conversely, a drought, a sudden sickness that swept through the village, a fire that consumed a home, or a difficult birth could be interpreted as God's displeasure, a punishment for individual or communal sin, or even the active work of Satan himself. This belief fostered a constant vigilance, a perpetual search for meaning in every misfortune, often leading to public days of fasting and prayer when adversity struck, begging God for mercy and confessing communal failings. And central to this worldview was the chilling, very real belief in the devil's active presence. Imagine the devil not as a metaphorical evil, but as a literal, powerful, malevolent entity prowling the earth, particularly targeting the Puritan New Israel in America. He was believed to work through temptations, through misfortune, and most terrifyingly, through human agents, witches. This pervasive, literal belief in the devil fueled an intense spiritual warfare in their minds and in their sermons. It was this deep-seated, unchallenged conviction in a literal, active Satan that would ultimately contribute to the profound fear and hysteria that culminated in the tragic events of the Salem Witch Trials. The internal landscape of the Puritan was thus a crucible of faith, fear, self-scrutiny, and an unwavering belief in a spiritual battle being waged within their very souls and around their nascent communities. Beyond the individual's spiritual journey and the family's daily toil, the Puritan village was fundamentally defined by its profound sense of community and its foundational concept of covenant. These were not merely collections of individuals. They were carefully constructed social units, bound by shared purpose and mutual obligation. At its very heart, the Puritan settlement was built upon a sacred covenant with God. Imagine the settlers believing they had entered into a solemn agreement with the divine. If they collectively upheld God's laws, lived righteously, and maintained the purity of their faith, God would bless and protect their city upon a hill in the wilderness. This belief created an immense sense of shared responsibility. If one person sinned, if the community deviated from God's path, it was believed that God might withdraw his favor from the entire settlement, bringing down collective judgment. This constant, shared spiritual pressure fostered a profound sense of interdependence, where the moral conduct of each individual was literally seen as vital for the salvation and prosperity of all. This shared burden manifested in practical ways through mutual support. Imagine the organized efforts of work bees, where neighbors would gather to help a new family build their house, or assist a farmer in bringing in a particularly difficult harvest. Sickness or death in a family would prompt immediate communal aid. Women bringing food, men helping with chores, everyone offering comfort and prayer. This was not charity in a modern sense, but a reciprocal expectation, a vital part of the covenant among themselves, where communal survival depended on mutual assistance. Yet this deep communal bond also came with the heavy weight of pervasive communal scrutiny. In a village where everyone knew everyone, and where privacy was limited by both architectural design and social expectation, there was simply no escaping the watchful eyes of your neighbors, the deacons, and the minister. Imagine the subtle, unspoken pressure to conform, to live a life that was above reproach. Any deviation from accepted moral or religious conduct was quickly noted, discussed, and often addressed by the community leaders. This was not malicious gossip, but a sincere, albeit often rigid, effort to maintain the spiritual purity and social order of the settlement. The selectivity of church membership was a key feature of this communal structure. While all residents were expected to attend church services, only those who could demonstrate a genuine, profound conversion experience, what they called being a visible saint, could become a full church member. This involved a rigorous process of public testimony and intense scrutiny by the church elders. Full membership brought immense social prestige and, crucially, granted voting rights in the powerful town meetings, the direct democratic body that governed local affairs. This created a subtle yet powerful hierarchy within the community, where spiritual status often directly intertwined with civic power, making the pursuit of grace not just a personal quest, but a pathway to influence. The town meeting itself was a testament to their unique blend of self-governance and spiritual control. Imagine all adult male church members gathering in the unadorned meeting house, debating and voting on local affairs, electing town officials, setting taxes, allocating common land, and discussing communal issues like defense or infrastructure. This was a form of direct democracy, but it was highly controlled. Dissent, while allowed, was often subtly discouraged, as consensus and unity were prized above individual opinion. The weight of these decisions was immense, for they believed their very prosperity, their very survival, rested on their ability to govern themselves in accordance with God's divine law. As we draw this deeply immersive journey into the Puritan village to a close, let us reflect upon the unseen costs and the enduring legacy of such a life. The strictures we have explored, the relentless labor, the pervasive piety, the communal scrutiny, the deep-seated fears, all combined to create a unique and profoundly demanding human experience. Imagine the sheer mental and physical endurance required to live this life, day in and day out, year after year. The constant fatigue from endless toil, the perpetual anxiety about one's spiritual state, the pressure to conform in every aspect of life. This was a society that valued hard work, unwavering piety, communal harmony, and strict conformity above all else. There was little room for individual expression, for artistic pursuits, or for the kind of personal freedom we often take for granted today. Laughter was not forbidden, but frivolity was discouraged. Moments of joy were often tied to communal milestones, a successful harvest, a safe return from a journey, the birth of a child, a spiritual revival, rather than personal indulgence. Yet, amidst these hardships, there was also a profound sense of purpose and belonging. For the devout Puritan, every hardship was a test, every success a blessing, every moment a step closer to God. The very strictness of their communal bonds provided a powerful sense of security in a dangerous, uncertain world. They were building something extraordinary, a new society founded on divine principles, and this shared vision, however stern, provided deep meaning to their arduous lives. The hidden truths of a Puritan village reveal a compelling, often challenging, portrait of human endeavor and spiritual fervor. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, relentless discipline, and an unwavering commitment to a perceived divine mandate. The psychological burden of constant self-examination, the fear of eternal damnation, and the pervasive watchfulness of neighbors created a unique internal landscape, a constant tension between grace and judgment. This era, however, also laid foundational stones for the American character, a strong work ethic, a deep respect for education, a commitment to self-governance, and a persistent thread of moral idealism. Yet, it also bequeathed a legacy of rigid social control, an inclination towards judgment, and a capacity for mass hysteria when faced with perceived threats. Truths that would tragically surface in events like the Salem Witch Trials. The quiet echoes of that 17th century village, the distant axe, the hum of the spinning wheel, the solemn toll of the meeting house bell, the whispers of fervent prayer continue to resonate. They remind us of a time when life was raw, faith was fierce, and the pursuit of a righteous existence shaped every single moment. This profound, detailed journey into their world is a testament to the enduring human spirit, and a gentle invitation for your mind to simply rest as these ancient rhythms fade into stillness. To truly, deeply, and profoundly grasp, to truly internalize the multifaceted being that was Cotton Mather, one must, with an almost reverent patience, first endeavor to comprehend the very essence from which his exceptional intellect and profound spirit emerged. He was not merely an isolated individual, a singular, detached entity arriving without context, but rather, undeniably, a crucial, vital link in a revered lineage. Significant ways came to define the very intellectual backbone and the spiritual conscience, the moral compass of nascent Puritan New England. His grandfather, Richard Mather, was a figure of truly profound importance, a venerable, esteemed minister, recognized across the fledgling colonies, his name spoken with respect in every settlement, and counted among the earliest, the most highly respected, and undeniably influential Puritan divines to undertake the arduous, perilous journey across the vast, churning, unpredictable Atlantic, and establish himself in the rugged, yet promising, new colony of Massachusetts. Imagine, for a moment, the immense courage, the unyielding conviction, the absolute, unshakable faith, and the sheer, relentless intellectual and spiritual force that was required to transplant such a profound, deeply rooted spiritual and academic tradition, a complete way of life and thought, from the established comforts of Old England to a wild, untamed, and often hostile new land. Think of the boundless faith that propelled them across that dangerous sea, facing the unknown wilderness, driven by a vision of a new Zion. Then, his own father, Increase Mather, ascended to an even more colossal stature, a figure of almost mythical proportions in his own lifetime. He was a man of unparalleled influence, serving, often simultaneously, in roles of immense power and responsibility. He was the esteemed president of Harvard College, not merely a ceremonial head, but an active, guiding force, the undisputed intellectual and theological heart of the entire colony. And, beyond the hallowed halls of academia, beyond the quiet of his study, he was a powerful, astute political negotiator, often embarking on arduous, perilous voyages back to England, crossing the treacherous ocean, braving storms and disease, to secure and meticulously safeguard the colony's fragile, hard-won new charter, ensuring its continued existence and unique religious mission, its very right to govern itself under God. Beyond these immense, often exhausting, civic duties, he was preeminently a minister, a divine orator, whose sermons did not merely preach doctrine. They possessed an immense, almost gravitational sway, a compelling power over the minds and the very souls of the Puritan populace. His voice, when raised in the pulpit, resonant and clear, could stir an entire town to fervent repentance, or console a grieving congregation with profound spiritual balm, or, indeed, subtly yet powerfully, guide the very direction, the very destiny of the nascent commonwealth, holding the reins of both spiritual and temporal power. Now, attempt to truly imagine, to feel deep within your being, within the quiet chamber of your own mind, what it must have been like to come of age, to grow and learn, to form one's earliest impressions, to shape one's worldview within a household so profoundly, so overwhelmingly steeped in such an immense, such an awe-inspiring legacy. From the very moment of his birth in the year 1663, in the modest yet intellectually rich home of his prominent father, Cotton Mather was utterly complete, just appreciated, but deeply, inextricably linked, fused, as if by divine fire, with profound piety. Every conversation within those walls, from the breakfast table to the late-night study sessions, every waking hour, every moment of quiet, intense contemplation, revolved meticulously around the intricate nuances of Calvinist theology, the sacred pronouncements of Scripture, often recited from memory in hushed tones, and the all-encompassing singular divine mission that, in their fervent view, was destined for New England, a new Eden, a city on a hill. The very air Cotton Mather breathed within his childhood home was not simply air. It was thick, palpable, almost heavy with the sheer weight of immense, unspoken expectation, a silent, yet ever-present, powerful pressure to not simply follow diligently in the venerable footsteps of his illustrious forebears, but to, perhaps, in the grand, inscrutable design of divine providence, to achieve an even greater measure of God's favor and renown, to become a greater instrument of his will. And indeed, the young Cotton Mather manifested himself as a genuine, undeniable child, prodigy. Picture, if you will, a small boy, perhaps just 6 or 7 years of age, his eyes bright with an almost preternatural intelligence, a quickness of mind that startled adults, already demonstrating an astonishing, almost uncanny intellectual capacity. He did not merely learn, he absorbed. His mind was not merely sharp, it was a sponge, eager to absorb, eager to understand, hungry for knowledge, for patterns, for connections. By the incredibly tender age of 12, a time when most children were just beginning to truly master basic literacy, to haltingly decipher complex texts, painstakingly sounding out words, Cotton Mather had already achieved a remarkable, profound mastery over both Latin and Greek, the ancient, foundational languages of classical scholarship, of philosophical discourse, and of deep theological inquiry. He didn't just read. His mind devoured texts, assimilating complex theological treatises, intricate philosophical arguments, and dense historical narratives with a remarkable, almost effortless ease. He would trace the elegant, severe Latin script with his finger, feeling the texture of the rough vellum, the words slowly unspooling in his mind like a tightly wound scroll of ancient wisdom, each phrase revealing deeper meaning. It is truly unfathomable, from our modern, accelerated perspective, to fully conceive of such a rigorous, such an extraordinarily accelerated intellectual foundation being laid at such an incredibly young age, forming the very framework of his being then, At the truly astonishing, almost unbelievable age of 11 years old, a mere boy, barely beyond childhood, he was formally admitted to Harvard College, the very esteemed institution over which his formidable father, Increased Mather, presided as its president. Try to visualize, in vivid detail, the Harvard of the late 17th century. It was not the sprawling, diverse, bustling campus we know today. It was a small, exceptionally austere, and profoundly dedicated academic establishment, existing for the almost singular, sacred purpose of rigorously training the next generation of highly learned ministers for what they fervently believed to be the new Israel. Days within those cold stone walls, often unheated beyond what small, sputtering fireplaces could provide, were filled, from the earliest pre-dawn hours, sometimes before sunrise, until deep into the night, by flickering candlelight with an intense, unyielding regimen of study. Imagine the deep concentration on the intricate rules of logic, on the art of disputation, on the persuasive arts of rhetoric, how to construct an argument, on the foundational principles of mathematics, learned from well-worn textbooks, their pages soft with use, and above all, the profound, endless depths of Puritan theology, the systematic study of God's revealed truth, the very blueprint of the universe. Imagine the Spartan, dimly lit rooms, often chilled to the bone in the long, biting New England winters, where flickering candlelight struggled to illuminate dense, Latin-laden texts, the pages brittle with age, their edges worn smooth by countless fingers, and solemn, often lengthy lectures droned on, punctuated only by the rhythmic scratch of quill on paper, the occasional cough, the shifting of wooden chairs. This was not a place for casual curiosity, nor for idle intellectual wandering, for distractions of any kind. It was a harsh, demanding crucible, a forge, honed to an almost fearsome precision, prepared not only for theological debate, but for spiritual battle against the very forces of darkness that they believed actively roamed the earth. Mather, with his formidable preternatural intellectual gifts, did not merely survive in this demanding environment. He thrived, he excelled, absorbing knowledge at an astonishing rate, graduating at the remarkably young age of 15, already possessing a mind honed to an almost frightening precision, brimming with accumulated knowledge, and pulsating with a fervent, almost zealous conviction. He was, by all accounts, ready for the world, yet still burdened by his own unique personal trial. However, despite this dazzling, almost superhuman intellectual prowess, this undeniable genius, this precocious brilliance, Cotton Mather was confronted, very early in his life, by a deeply personal, profoundly humbling challenge, one that he himself interpreted as a direct, profound spiritual trial. He suffered from a severe, persistent stutter. Imagine the deep, agonizing frustration, the almost crushing anguish, the feeling of helplessness of a young man undeniably destined for the hallowed pulpit, for the powerful delivery of God's word, for commanding the attention of congregations, whose very voice, his primary instrument of connection, of persuasion, of spiritual guidance, would frequently falter, stumble, or even completely fail him at critical, public moments. The words would simply not come, or would emerge in a halting, broken fashion. In an era where eloquent, powerful, and sustained public speaking was not merely a desirable skill, but a paramount, essential necessity for a minister, a crucial, mark of his calling. This speech impediment was far more than a simple physical flaw. It became in his deeply introspective, spiritually attuned mind a profound spiritual wrestling match, a test of his very soul, a perceived sign of God's potential displeasure, a subtle yet terrifying test of his faith, a daunting, seemingly insurmountable barrier that threatened to impede or even completely block his undeniable, urgent, divine calling. He grappled with this affliction deeply, persistently, and with profound humility, often retreating to his private study to pray, earnestly, fervently, for deliverance, seeking every conceivable remedy, physical or spiritual, from herbs to fasting. He would close his eyes, feeling the frustrating, knotting catch in his throat, the words tangling and refusing to emerge, and then he would pour out his soul to God, begging for clarity, for a smooth flow of expression, for his tongue to be loosed like Moses, and eventually, through sheer willpower, relentless practice, and, most importantly, through profound spiritual discipline and unceasing prayer, he found ways to manage it, to speak with a deliberate cadence, a measured solemnity that often masked his underlying difficulty. He even came to interpret it, paradoxically, not as a curse or a mark of weakness, but as a crucible, a divinely ordained test that ultimately served to deepen his profound reliance on God, forcing him to surrender his own human will and trust entirely in divine strength and utterance, believing God would speak through him despite his weakness. His eventual, unwavering commitment to the ministry was not, therefore, a casual professional choice, a mere career path, or a stepping stone to worldly influence, but rather a profound, almost inevitable, spiritual destiny. He meticulously wrestled with the very state of his own soul, examining every thought, every impulse, every stray desire with relentless Puritan scrutiny, undergoing what he described as a powerful, transformative conversion experience, one that left him with an undeniable, almost physically urgent call to devote his entire being, his every waking moment, his every breath, to serving God and his chosen people, to building his kingdom on earth. Imagine the immense, consuming, spiritual zeal that propelled him relentlessly forward, a zeal constantly fueled by the towering intellectual heritage of his family, by the sheer, formidable power of his own expansive mind, and by an unshakable, deeply ingrained conviction that New England was not merely a new colony, a distant outpost, but a truly sacred, chosen land, a vital, crucial battleground in the eternal cosmic war being waged between the forces of a benevolent, omnipotent God and the insidious, ever-present powers of the devil. The sheer, overwhelming burden of this inherited mantle, this divine calling, this profound sense of cosmic purpose, this belief in his pivotal role in sacred history was, without question, both his greatest, most potent strength and, ironically, a subtle yet profound source of his fervent, unyielding, absolute certainty in the face of the ultimate mysteries of the invisible world that lay just beyond human sight, always watchful, always threatening. Cotton Mather was, by any and all measures, far more than a mere minister. However influential and celebrated he might have become, he was a genuine, astonishing polymath of his era, a true scholar of boundless curiosity, a man whose prodigious, restless intellect was deeply passionately engaged with the full spectrum of intellectual currents flowing through the late 17th and early 18th centuries. His profound curiosity transcended the rigid disciplinary boundaries of his time, embracing even what we might now tentatively label as the very nascent stages of modern science and empirical inquiry. He was not confined to theology, but saw it as the organizing principle of all knowledge. To truly grasp the intricate complexity, the delicate balance of his views on witchcraft, it becomes absolutely crucial, profoundly essential, to perceive how he meticulously, painstakingly integrated his profound, unwavering theology, his comprehensive understanding of God's divine plan, his attributes, his covenant with his expansive, almost insatiable intellectual curiosity. For Mather, the entire natural world, with all its intricate workings, its seasons, its creatures, its celestial mechanics, and indeed the equally real, albeit unseen, invisible world of spirits, angels, and demons, were nothing less than grand, intricate manifestations of God's majestic, benevolent, and ultimately sovereign divine design. Every phenomenon, every observation, every perplexing mystery, every affliction was ultimately a reflection of God's will, his power, and his ongoing providential care over his creation and his chosen people. His Puritan worldview was not simply a set of abstract beliefs or doctrines. It was the foundational, omnipresent, all-encompassing lens through which he meticulously observed, painstakingly interpreted, and ultimately understood every single aspect of his existence. For Mather, the world was not just a physical place, a collection of material objects. It was, quite literally, a cosmic battleground. Imagine, for a moment, his profound, unshakable certainty. God was not an abstract concept, distant and unknowable, removed from human affairs. He was real, infinitely powerful, intimately, actively involved in the intricate details of human affairs, guiding every sparrow's fall, shaping every human destiny, punishing sin, rewarding virtue, intervening directly, and crucially, for Mather, the devil was equally real, not a metaphor or a symbolic representation of evil, not merely the darker side of human nature, but a literal, malevolent, cunning entity, a fallen angel, commanding vast legions of demonic spirits, relentlessly seeking to undermine God's sacred kingdom on earth. This was not allegorical poetry or fanciful superstition. For him, it was fundamental, tangible reality, as real as the wooden floorboards beneath his feet or the ink on his parchment. Every misfortune that unexpectedly befell a sudden illness, a failed crop, a lost ship, every perplexing illness that gripped a body with inexplicable symptoms, every strange, inexplicable occurrence that disrupted the calm order of the village, could potentially be interpreted as a direct, undeniable manifestation of this ongoing spiritual warfare. This cosmic struggle between good and evil, a direct assault from Satan. He held an unyielding, almost desperate conviction that New England, having been specially chosen by God as a sanctuary, a sacred new Israel in the vast, untamed wilderness, a beacon of pure Protestantism, was, by extension, a particularly tempting, a uniquely vulnerable target for Satan's most insidious and cunning machinations, his most direct, concentrated assaults. For if he could corrupt New England, he could shatter God's grand plan. This pervasive, almost apocalyptic sense of urgency, the feeling that he was living in the very last days, at the climax of sacred history, where the fate of the world hung on New England's righteousness. The fervent passion of his sermons, fueling the relentless output of his voluminous writings and empowering his unceasing, almost desperate efforts to uphold the purity and integrity of the Puritan faith, believing that the very destiny, the very salvation of the entire colony hung precariously in the balance. A holy covenant that could be broken by sin or demonic influence. Yet, despite this profound, unyielding theological grounding, Mather was also intensely, almost ravenously, interested in natural philosophy, the expansive field that served as the intellectual precursor to what we now identify as modern science. He was not close-minded to new ideas or observations that challenged old assumptions. He meticulously corresponded with leading European scientists, engaged in spirited, rigorous exchanges of ideas with the prestigious Royal Society of London, a vibrant beacon of scientific inquiry and empirical observation in his time, sharing his own observations and experiments. He performed his own observations of comets and natural phenomena, recording them with precision, and he amassed a truly vast, awe-inspiring personal library, a treasure trove of knowledge collected over decades. Imagine stepping into such a library, a sanctuary of quiet thought, where the very air was infused with the very tangible smell of old paper, a faint, almost sweet decay of cellulose from ancient pages mingled with the rich, earthy scent of ancient leather bindings that had absorbed centuries of dust and quiet study, their surfaces smooth and worn under countless hands, perhaps even a subtle hint of beeswax from the candles that illuminated so many late-night sessions, a faint, metallic tang of fresh ink within its quiet, sacred confines, bathed in the soft glow of natural light filtering through leaded panes. One would find not only countless theological treatises and classical literature, but also intricate, detailed works on medicine, the complex movements of astronomy, and the detailed classifications of botany and zoology, alongside philosophical works by Bacon, Locke, and Descartes. Imagine the profound, quiet contemplation of a man utterly immersed in the accumulated knowledge of his time, seeking connections, drawing conclusions, relentlessly pursuing understanding from every available source, believing that all knowledge ultimately pointed back to the divine. He meticulously observed natural phenomena, studied the perplexing progression of diseases with the available medical knowledge of the day, painstakingly documenting symptoms and effects, and, in a truly revolutionary and profoundly controversial move for his era, he even championed the practice of smallpox inoculation, a medical intervention that was both highly risky and profoundly radical for its time, requiring a leap of faith in human agency in the face of divine providence, earning him public scorn and even violent threats. He saw it as a tool from God to combat disease, not an interference with divine providence. For Cotton Mather, there was, crucially, no inherent conflict, no intellectual dissonance, no spiritual contradiction between his passionate scientific curiosity and his fervent absolute belief in the literal reality of witchcraft. Instead, he perceived witchcraft not as an isolated, supernatural phenomenon entirely divorced from the natural world, a mere superstition, but as a dark, perverse branch of natural philosophy itself, sinister realm where the devil, through his immense yet divinely permitted power for Satan, could only act as God allowed, was allowed by God to manipulate the very fabric of the natural world through human agents. The witches, who had willingly surrendered their souls through a formal pact. The supernatural was not a realm entirely separate from reality, existing in some ethereal dimension. It was simply another, albeit hidden, malevolent, and often terrifying layer of reality, one fully integrated into the grand complex and ultimately ordered cosmic design of God. He held the deep, unshakable conviction that understanding the devil's insidious methods, even when manifested through the terrifying acts of witchcraft, was not merely an academic pursuit, an intellectual curiosity, or a morbid fascination. It was, for him, a vital spiritual duty, a form of spiritual intelligence gathering, essential for the defense of God's kingdom. It was, he believed, a powerful means to better combat the forces of darkness and, crucially, to unequivocally demonstrate God's ultimate, unchallengeable power and sovereignty over all forms of evil, both seen and unseen, proving that even Satan's machinations ultimately served God's greater purpose. His profound views were also significantly, deeply shaped by the broader, pervasive European context of witchcraft beliefs that had raged across the continent for centuries, leaving a trail of death and terror. Imagine not just a local phenomenon, but centuries upon centuries of terrifying trials across the vast expanse of Europe, from the grim, misty mountains of Scotland to the sun-drenched, wine-producing valleys of Germany, from the somber courts of England to the inquisitions of Spain. Countless learned scholarly treatises penned by respected theologians, eminent jurists, and learned philosophers, all of whom affirmed with unwavering certainty the literal reality of witches and their infernal pacts with the devil. Mather was not, therefore, creating a new concept out of thin air, nor was he an isolated anomaly, a singular voice of strange beliefs. He was, rather, actively participating in and profoundly contributing to a deeply entrenched, globally recognized, and intellectually supported theological and legal tradition. He would sit for hours in his study, the candlelight guttering low, his quill scratching steadily across the paper, meticulously annotating the margins of these voluminous European texts, cross-referencing their case studies with his own observations, his own rigorous scholarship, meticulously built upon this vast foundation of prior European thought and chilling case studies, ultimately lent his convictions particular weight, undeniable authority, and widespread credibility throughout the colonies whose intellectual ties remained strong with Europe. He consumed these intricate European texts, drawing deeply on their established methodologies for identification, their chilling accounts of demonic possession, and their authoritative conclusions, diligently applying them to the unique, challenging, and spiritually significant experience of colonial New England. He was unshakably convinced that the specific instances of demonic possession and the bewildering accusations of witchcraft that emerged in his own time were not mere folklore, nor were they fleeting moments of mental illness, nor simple human deception, but rather tangible, empirical, and undeniable evidence of the devil's active, desperate, and escalating campaign against the vulnerable, yet divinely chosen, Puritan faithful. This deeply held belief, buttressed by centuries of learned opinion and affirmed by his own meticulous observations, tragically yet undeniably set the intricate stage for his profound engagement with the terrifying and ultimately catastrophic events that would soon violently erupt in Salem, a storm that had been brewing for generations. Let us begin, then, with spectral evidence, a concept so foreign, so utterly alien to our modern understanding of justice, yet so profoundly real and terrifying to the Puritan mind. Try to visualize, in your mind's eye, the stark, dimly lit interior of the courthouse, the light filtering through small, grimy panes of glass, casts long. The very air is thick, palpable, with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and an almost metallic tang of fear clinging to the wooden benches and the rough cloth of their garments. The low murmur of the gathered crowd, a restless, fearful hum, is hushed to an almost suffocating silence, hanging heavy and expectant. Then, suddenly, without warning, the profound, unsettling stillness is violently shattered by the piercing, almost inhuman shriek of a young girl, perhaps Abigail Williams, or Ann Putnam Jr., or Mary Walcotta, sound that scrapes against the very marrow of one's bones. A sound that promises unspeakable agony. Her body, small and frail, begins to contort violently, sickeningly, her limbs twisting into impossible, grotesque shapes, as if unseen ropes pull and wrench at her joints, her muscles spasming against her will. Her eyes roll back, showing only the terrifying whites, and a low, guttural moan. An almost animalistic sound escapes her lips. She points a trembling, accusatory finger, a finger that seems to vibrate with a frantic, uncontrollable energy, directly across the crowded, silent room, aimed precisely at an accused individual. This might be Rebecca Nurse, an elderly, highly respected, and profoundly pious woman from the community, whose very presence until moments ago exuded a quiet dignity and grace, or the frail, seemingly confused Bridget Bishop, a woman already marginalized, perhaps even disliked, a convenient target. "She does torment me," the girl gasps, her voice choked with what appears to be genuine, soul-deep agony, her face contorted in a mask of pure terror, sweat beading on her brow. Her specter, her spirit does pinch me. It chokes me. I see her there, upon her, and as she cries out, describing invisible tortures with vivid, chilling detail, the accused, standing bewildered and often physically restrained before the stern. They might be standing perfectly still, their faces etched with profound confusion, disbelieving fear, or utter, uncomprehending despair. They might whisper a fervent prayer, or shake their head slowly in denial. Yet the afflicted girl, or another, among the growing circle of accusers seated nearby, will continue to writhe and scream, describing in vivid, they claim to be suffering at the hands of the accused, spectral form, their ethereal double, their spirit unbound from their body and sent forth to do Satan's bidding. For the magistrates, and indeed, not a cunning act of human deception, nor was it dismissed as a mere delusion born of sickness or mass hysteria. No, for them it was profoundly, terrifyingly real. Their unshakable belief system provided a clear, seemingly irrefutable framework for understanding this bewildering, terrifying phenomenon. In their worldview, the devil, the literal embodiment of pure evil, was an actual, cunning, and immensely powerful entity. He possessed the ability, granted to him by God, not for evil's triumph, but for God's mysterious, inscrutable purposes, to manifest himself, or to send his demonic agents in spectral form to torment and tempt the righteous. And crucially, a central tenet, articulated by esteemed theologians like Cotton Mather and deeply embedded in their understanding of spiritual warfare, was this: the devil could not, by divine decree and his own inherent limitations, take the shape of an innocent person to cause harm. Therefore, if the tormented accuser claimed to see the specter of a specific individual causing their suffering, then, by logical and theological necessity, that specific individual must have entered into a solemn, infernal pact with the devil, giving him permission to use their form. This made spectral evidence, for the Puritan mind, a direct, terrifying, and undeniable link between the visible world and the invisible realm of spiritual warfare. It was, in effect, deemed a divinely permitted form of proof, an undeniable sign of a soul's damnation and its active alliance with cosmic evil. This profound belief, deeply embedded in their consciousness, chillingly paved the way for convictions where no tangible physical evidence of harm, no confession, no witch's mark was ever present or even possible. The very inability of the accused to see or feel the specter that bore their likeness and tormented others only further confirmed their guilt in the eyes of the court. It was proof of their hardened heart, their deep immersion in Satan's dark arts, rendering them immune to the very torments they inflicted. For the devil protected his own. This acceptance of spectral evidence created an agonizing, inescapable dilemma for the accused. Imagine the terror, the profound confusion, the utter despair gripping an individual like Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman known for her piety, her years of upright living, her very life, a testament to Puritan values, suddenly accused by a group of screaming, convulsing girls she barely knew, girls whose torment appeared utterly genuine to the onlookers. She stands there, bewildered, denying the accusations with every fiber of her being, her voice trembling, perhaps, but unwavering in its insistence on her innocence. She pleads with the judges, with her neighbors, invoking God's name, swearing her purity. Yet, as she speaks, as she gestures, as she even so much as shifts her weight, the accusers writhe on the floor, through their bodies. She cannot see the tormenting specter that bears her own likeness, cannot feel its malevolent acts, yet her very denial is taken as further evidence of her profound guilt, proof of a hardened heart, a refusal to repent, a deep, almost demonic stubbornness. What could she possibly do? How could she prove a negative? How could one logically or physically defend against an invisible attack that only her accusers could perceive? Her cries of innocence were perceived not as righteous indignation, but as diabolical deception, a further sign of her allegiance to the master of lies, Satan, who emboldened her to resist the truth. The very act of denying the accusation was seen as an affront to God and the court, a stubborn refusal to confess and seek mercy, sealing her own tragic fate. Then came the chilling, manipulative power of personal testimonies, particularly those extracted through immense pressure and profound psychological coercion. The accused were not merely presented with the spectral evidence and the terrifying public spectacle of the afflicted. They were relentlessly, systematically urged, often for hours on end, across multiple grueling interrogation sessions, to confess. Imagine the relentless questioning by the magistrates, their faces grim, stern, their voices unyielding, their eyes piercing, their questions framed not to ascertain innocence, but to elicit guilt, built upon the premise that a witch must confess to be cleansed. The accused, already terrified, exhausted, perhaps weakened by days or weeks in the cold, damp confinement of a Puritan jail cell, often denied sufficient food, water, and warmth, separated from family and comfort, were confronted with a horrific, soul-crushing choice, a true Hobson's choice that offered no good option: confess and live. To confess, even falsely, to an infernal pact with the devil, to admitting to tormenting their neighbors through dark arts, meant they would likely be spared the hangman's noose. A confession, within the Puritan theological framework, was seen as a sign of potential repentance, a crack in the devil's hold over their soul, offering the slim, terrifying hope of redemption, a pathway, however painful, to God's mercy and the preservation of their earthly life. Those who confessed, admitting their guilt and providing details of their supposed evil deeds, were often kept alive in prison, sometimes for months or even years, tormented by their conscience but spared immediate death. This was a perverse incentive, a horrifying moral trap, forcing individuals to betray their own truth, to condemn themselves by their own words, for the sake of their very lives, sacrificing their integrity to merely survive, deny and die, to steadfastly maintain one's innocence, to repeatedly and vehemently deny any involvement with the devil, meant almost certain condemnation and a swift trip to the gallows. For the Puritan court, such an unyielding denial, in the face of what they believed to be irrefutable spectral evidence, and often the fervent testimony of the afflicted, was interpreted as the ultimate sign of a hardened, unrepentant heart, a soul utterly lost to Satan, defiant even unto death, making the accused a grave danger to the very fabric of the godly community. They were seen as beyond saving, beyond grace, beyond the reach of human justice, and thus fit only for execution, to be purged from the community as an example. This horrifying dilemma, coupled with the immense social pressure to conform, to admit guilt, often led to a terrifying phenomenon, a cascade of false confessions. Imagine the unbearable weight of this choice: dying for a truth no one believed, or living a lie that stained one's immortal soul and perhaps condemned others. Some, driven to the brink of utter despair and mental collapse, perhaps genuinely convinced by the overwhelming fervor around them, the relentless accusations, and the powerful theological arguments, that they must have, unknowingly, inadvertently, made a pact with the devil, even without conscious memory or intent, eventually broke. Their minds, shattered by fear and exhaustion, might create false memories, or they might simply parrot what was expected of them. They confessed, often providing intricate, terrifying details of infernal meetings in the woods, spectral flights over the village, and the solemn signing of the devil's black book with their own blood, details that were, tragically, then used as new, compelling evidence to implicate even more innocent individuals. expanding the ever-tightening net of accusation across the already fractured community, ensnaring more and more souls. These confessions, often detailed and vivid, were then used as compelling, tangible evidence to buttress the spectral accusations, lending them an aura of undeniable truth in the eyes of the court and the public, creating a terrifying feedback loop where each new confession reinforced the reality of the conspiracy. The chilling touch test was another terrifying manifestation of this judicial process, an almost theatrical performance of guilt. Imagine a scene replayed again and again in the courtroom. An accused individual, perhaps a frail, elderly woman, her face pale with fear and exhaustion, is brought before the screaming, convulsing accusers. The girls, in the throes of their fits, are seemingly incapacitated, their bodies rigid or writhing, their eyes closed, their ears perhaps covered. A magistrate or an officer of the court, with a solemn, grim face, will take the accused hand, perhaps her trembling, gnarled hand, cold from fear, and guide it to lightly touch one of the afflicted girls. The moment the accused hand made contact, the tormented girl would almost instantaneously cease her convulsions. Her body would relax, her screams would subside, her eyes would return to normal, and she would stand calm and composed, as if magically restored. For the court, this was considered irrefutable, divine proof of guilt. The touch of the accused, the witch, had mysteriously broken the spell, releasing the demon's hold. This was further confirmation of the witch's inherent malevolent power, a physical manifestation of the invisible bond between the accused and their demonic master. The underlying belief was that the devil, at the witch's command, tormented the victim until the witch, by touching the victim, reclaimed the demonic energy or released the tormenting spirit. Recognized as a cruel, manipulative farce, a terrifying piece of performance, whether conscious or unconscious on the part of the accusers, where they played their part with chilling precision, sealing the fate of the accused, condemning them with a mere touch. Asterisk. The cumulative effect of spectral evidence and these coerced testimonies was utterly devastating. It plunged the community into a profound, pervasive state of fear and distrust, eroding the very foundations of communal harmony. Neighbors who had shared meals, worshipped together, and helped each other build homes suddenly turned against neighbors, suspicion poisoning every interaction. Families fractured under the immense strain as accusations tore through bloodlines, setting child against parent, sibling against sibling. The very concept of justice became profoundly distorted, twisted into a terrifying, unrecognizable form, where innocence was impossible to prove and guilt was assumed by accusation. The spectral attacks, invisible and terrifyingly pervasive, meant that literally anyone could be a witch, even the most pious, the most respected, the most unlikely. This created an atmosphere where accusation itself became condemnation, where the mere utterance of a name could mean imprisonment, torture, and death. The line between genuine spiritual struggle and human hysteria blurred into an indistinguishable, terrifying haze, making it impossible for even the most well-meaning to discern truth from illusion. The chilling, deeply unsettling echoes of these practices, and the profound questions they raise about the nature of truth, justice, and collective delusion, continue to resonate through our collective consciousness, serving as a solemn, enduring cautionary tale. They stand as a permanent reminder of the immense, destructive power of fear, unchecked authority, and the tragic susceptibility of human judgment when confronted with the bewildering, terrifying, and ultimately inexplicable shadows of the invisible world. The memories of these agonizing choices and the cries of the condemned still haunt the silent fields of Salem, a chilling testament to the fragile line between belief and profound, irrevocable tragedy. To truly, deeply, and profoundly grasp, to truly internalize the pervasive influence of the colonial elite, one must, with an almost reverent patience, first endeavor to comprehend the very essence, the foundational aesthetics, the visible manifestations of their elevated status. Their homes were not merely shelters from the harsh New England climate. They were meticulously crafted statements, architectural declarations of power, permanence, and prosperity. Unlike the smaller, utilitarian dwellings of the common farmer or artisan, built for necessity and endurance, the residences of the governor, the prominent merchants, and the leading ministers stood apart, often multiple stories tall, with intricate brickwork or finely painted clapboard featuring multiple chimneys, indicating numerous hearths for warmth and comfort, a far cry from a single central fireplace. Imagine the imposing facade, perhaps with symmetrically placed windows, their panes imported glass, each one reflecting the distant sky, and a grand, often paneled, front door, solid and inviting. But to host political gatherings, to entertain visiting dignitaries, and to serve as visible symbols of their occupants' divine favor and worldly success. Step inside, if you will, into the imagined interior of such a home. The air, even indoors, feels different, perhaps warmer, more still, less prone to drafts due to thicker walls and tighter construction. The floors are not rough-hewn planks, but polished, wide wooden boards, perhaps even imported from distant forests, reflecting the soft glow of candlelight or the pale, filtered light of the sun. The walls, rather than being simple plaster, might be adorned with imported wallpaper, its patterns muted and elegant, or paneled with rich, dark woods, meticulously carved and fitted. Look around at the furnishings, not the sparse, functional pieces of a common household, but sturdy, expertly crafted chairs and tables made by the finest local joiners, or even imported from England. There would often dark and heavy, upholstered perhaps with velvet or damask, colors deep and muted, tapestries or large framed maps, sometimes even painted portraits of ancestors or biblical scenes would adorn the walls, speaking not only of wealth but of taste and a connection to a wider, cultivated world. And then consider the possessions themselves, each object a silent yet eloquent testament to status and global reach. Imagine, for a quiet moment, the gleam of fine pewter and silver on a sideboard, not just for show, but for daily use, their weight satisfying in the hand, each piece individually crafted, perhaps bearing the family crest. The delicate clink of porcelain cups, so fragile and utterly exotic, imported from far-off China, would replace the sturdy earthenware of the common household. Visualize the rich, heavy fabric of imported broadcloth and silk used for clothing, for curtains, for upholstery, its texture luxurious against the skin, its colors deep and rich, indicating access to international markets and the disposable income to acquire such luxuries. Think of the mirrors, rare and expensive, their mercury-backed glass reflecting the flickering candlelight, distorting images slightly, yet serving as potent symbols of vanity and refined living. These possessions were far more than mere comforts. They were meticulously curated symbols, a silent language understood by all within the stratified society of colonial Massachusetts. Every object, every piece of furniture, every item of clothing served as a subtle yet powerful declaration of one's standing within the intricate social hierarchy. It was a tangible manifestation of one's prosperity, one's connections, and within the Puritan worldview, even one's perceived divine favor of one's election. Thus, displaying wealth, while carefully avoiding ostentatious excess, which might be seen as sinful pride, became a delicate balancing act, a subtle performance of piety and prosperity. To be seen with such possessions was to confirm one's place at the apex of society, to reinforce the perceived natural order of things, where God ordained certain individuals for leadership and worldly success. The governor's table was not merely a venue for lavish meals or social display. It was, more profoundly, the silent, beating heart of colonial Massachusetts's intricate political and economic life. Around this very table, in the flickering glow of beeswax candles, and later, perhaps, in the morning light filtering through the polished panes, they were a tightly knit, intricately connected network of individuals whose destinies were deeply, inextricably intertwined, often through multiple, reinforcing bonds, family ties, shared economic interests, and a collective, unwavering commitment to the Puritan vision. Imagine the faces gathered there, the governor himself, perhaps a recent appointee from England, keenly aware of his precarious position between the crown and the fiercely independent colonial spirit. Alongside him, the most prominent magistrates, often wealthy merchants or respected legal scholars, whose interpretations of law and justice held immense sway over daily life. The colony's leading merchants, their fortunes built on complex networks of trade stretching across the Atlantic, their ships bringing in vital supplies and exporting colonial goods, and, crucially, the most revered and influential ministers, men like Increase Mather and, later, Cotton Mather himself, whose theological pronouncements and spiritual authority profoundly shaped public opinion and moral conduct, lending divine sanction to political decisions. Their discussions, often taking place over shared meals or after the formal dinner, were far from casual. They delved into the deepest, most pressing issues facing the young, vulnerable colony. Visualize the intensity in their eyes as they debated the delicate, often contentious relationship with the distant English crown, constantly wary of any encroachment on their hard-won self-governance and religious liberties. Their charter, a fragile document. Picture them meticulously strategizing to ensure the economic prosperity of the colony, discussing trade routes, tariffs, and the intricate dance of supply and demand in a world where communication was slow and perilous. Listen, in your mind's ear, as they deliberated over complex land disputes, the allocation of vital resources, and the ever-present challenges of defending the sprawling, vulnerable frontier from hostile Native American tribes and rival European powers. Every decision made at this table, every consensus reached, every policy debated, had profound and far-reaching consequences for the lives of thousands of colonists. Fluidity, the almost seamless intermingling of political, economic, and religious power, was a defining characteristic of colonial Massachusetts. These were not separate spheres of influence, as we often conceive them today. The same individuals, often members of the same prominent families, frequently held overlapping roles, blurring the lines of authority and creating an almost impenetrable web of influence. A judge in the very courts that decided commercial disputes, a powerful minister might also be a trusted advisor to the governor, his sermons subtly influencing public policy and the moral tone of the community, his words carrying the weight of divine authority into the temporal realm. This intertwining created a robust, yet often insular, system of governance where decisions were often made among a small, interconnected circle of elite men, their personal relationships, their shared histories, and their common interests profoundly shaping the direction of the entire colony. This interconnectedness fostered a deeply conservative political culture, where dissent was often viewed with suspicion, not merely as a political disagreement, but as a challenge to divine order and communal stability, and its unshakable belief in the righteousness of their cause. The governor's table, therefore, represented not just a place of power, but a crucible where the destiny of colonial Massachusetts was forged, shaped by the hands and minds of a select few, and practical interests would echo throughout the generations. Asterisk. The act of dining at the governor's table was far more than a simple necessity for sustenance. It was a meticulously choreographed ritual, a subtle yet powerful spectacle designed to reinforce and publicly display the intricate social hierarchy of colonial Massachusetts. Every detail, from the arrangement of the seating to the selection of the dishes, was imbued with meaning, serving to confirm and re-establish the established order in the eyes of all who attended. Even the silent servants who moved discreetly in the background. Imagine the scene: the long, polished table, laden with a bountiful, carefully prepared meal. The dishes themselves would be a testament to the colony's growing prosperity and its access to global trade networks. While simpler than a European royal feast, it would be far grander than the fare of common colonists. Visualize platters of roasted game, perhaps a plump turkey or venison, glistening under the candlelight, alongside hearty beef and pork. There would be a variety of garden vegetables, perhaps root crops from the cellar, or, if the season allowed, fresh greens, all prepared with the best imported spices. Breads, fresh from the oven, would be abundant, and perhaps a rich, savory pie, its crust golden and flaky. For dessert, a carefully crafted pudding, or perhaps even preserved fruits, a rare treat, sweetened with costly imported sugar. The drinks would be equally indicative of status, not just local cider or beer, but imported wines, particularly the dark, potent Madeira, so favored by the elite, served in polished pewter tankards, or, for the most distinguished guests, in delicate, gleaming glass. The seating arrangement itself was a silent, yet powerfully explicit declaration of status. At the very head of the table, commanding the view of the entire room, sat the governor, his position undeniable. To his immediate right and left, in descending order of prestige, would be seated the most prominent guests: the deputy governor, perhaps then the chief justice, followed by the most influential members of the general court, the wealthiest merchants, and the most revered senior ministers. Imagine the subtle cues, the finest goblets reserved for the highest ranking, the most delicate cuts of meat offered first to those of greatest import. Every gesture, every subtle nod, every deferential comment reinforced the strict pecking order, making it clear to all present who held power and who was deemed worthy of the highest respect in the social and political landscape of the colony. Beyond the formal display, these dinners served as crucial opportunities for social bonding and political maneuvering. As the meal progressed, and the initial formality perhaps eased slightly, conversations would shift from solemn matters of state to more personal, yet still politically charged, discussions. Imagine the low, measured tones of men exchanging news from London, discussing the latest shipping manifests from distant ports, or debating the intricate nuances of a newly proposed law. Favors would be discreetly sought and granted, alliances subtly reinforced, and rivalries carefully navigated. A shared laugh, a well-timed compliment, a knowing glance across the table, these were the unspoken languages of elite networking, solidifying relationships that extended far beyond the dining hall into the council chambers, the counting houses, and the pulpits. The very act of breaking bread together, of sharing these rare luxuries, created an intimate yet powerful bond, fostering a sense of shared purpose and collective identity among this exclusive group. The governor's table, therefore, was a multifaceted stage where power was not only exercised but also profoundly performed and reinforced. It was a tangible space where the social, political, and economic hierarchies of colonial Massachusetts were not merely understood in abstract terms, but were lived, breathed, and solidified through the elegant ritual of the shared meal. It showcased the wealth and influence of the elite, their meticulous attention to status, and the intricate web of connections that bound them together, defining the very essence of elite life in the burgeoning colonies. Beyond the immediate spectacle of the dinner and the overt discussions, the true, profound influence emanating from the governor's table was often subtly exerted, shaping the destiny of thousands in ways that were seldom directly observed or explicitly documented. The real power lay not just in the formal declarations of the general court, but in the informal agreements, the quiet understandings, the unspoken consensus reached among this select group. Consider, for a moment, the atmosphere after the meal. As the servants cleared away the last dishes, and the men, perhaps, retired to a private study, filled with leather-bound books and the scent of aged spirits. In these more intimate, less public settings, true power was often exercised. Here, the subtle interplay of personal relationships, economic interests, and deeply held religious beliefs would coalesce into policy. A powerful merchant whose ships faced a particular tax burden might subtly sway a magistrate during a casual, late-night conversation, hinting at potential economic instability if the policy were to persist. A minister, deeply concerned about a perceived moral decline, might passionately appeal to the governor, emphasizing the need for stricter enforcement of Sabbath laws or greater vigilance against spiritual threats, drawing on his immense moral authority. Decisions that would later be presented as the reasoned, official pronouncements of the colonial government often had their genesis in these informal, yet incredibly influential gatherings. The lines between personal persuasion and public policy were exquisitely blurred, creating a system that, while seemingly orderly, was deeply susceptible to the biases and interests of the powerful few. This elite, gathered around the governor's table, held a deeply ingrained, almost sacrosanct, belief in their own moral and intellectual superiority, viewing themselves as divinely appointed stewards of the colony's spiritual and temporal well-being. Their decisions, no matter how harsh or controversial, were often justified through the lens of divine providence and the preservation of the new Israel. This collective certainty, shared among the colony's leaders, formed a powerful, almost impenetrable barrier to dissent or alternative perspectives, especially from those outside their inner circle. Any challenge to their authority, any questioning of their judgment, could be interpreted not merely as political opposition, but as a direct affront to God's ordained order, a dangerous step towards chaos and spiritual decay. The enduring shadow of this elite life and political power in colonial Massachusetts is complex. While these gatherings fostered a degree of stability and directed the early growth of the colony, they also created an inherently insular and often rigid system. It was a system that, for all its piety and outward display of order, struggled profoundly when confronted with challenges that fell outside its established frameworks of understanding. The Salem Witch Trials, in many ways, exposed the fundamental vulnerability of such a tightly controlled and deeply certain power structure when faced with the inexplicable, the terrifying, and the ultimately uncontrollable. The very mechanisms of power, the reliance on elite consensus, the intertwining of religious and political authority, the emphasis on maintaining social order which typically ensured stability, paradoxically contributed to the escalation and tragic duration of the crisis. The governor's table, therefore, serves as a powerful symbol. It represents not just the physical space where decisions were made, but the invisible network of power, the silent understandings, and the profound, deeply held beliefs that shaped an entire society. It reminds us that history is not just about grand events, but about the intricate dance of human relationships, ambition, faith, and the often unseen forces that dictate the lives of millions. From the grandest mansion to the humblest cottage, all within the long, complex shadow cast by the very few who held power.